Tonight, I want to take you to a narrow street in old London where the fog lingers low against the cobblestones and a small bakery window glows long before the sun begins to rise. Inside, an elderly baker has already lit his oven. The warmth gathers slowly, and the scent of fresh bread begins to fill the quiet air. But there is one loaf each morning that rises just a little differently from the rest, and the baker always notices it before the story truly begins. Stay here with me for a moment. Let the warmth of the oven reach you, and allow this quiet little bakery to slow the world down. Part 1. The warm light on Pudding Lane. The city had not yet woken. In that tender hour before dawn, when the cobblestones of London still held the dampness of night, and the gas lamps flickered their last yellow breath before extinguishing, Pudding Lane lay silent beneath a veil of soft, silver fog. The mist moved slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the sleeping world, curling around doorways and settling into the crevices between the old timber-framed buildings that leaned companionably toward one another across the narrow street. The church bells of St. Margaret Pattens had not yet called the faithful to morning prayer. The costermongers had not wheeled their barrows into position. The crossing sweepers had not begun their quiet work. Even the sparrows, those ever-present companions of the London streets, remained tucked beneath eaves and ledges, their small heads folded beneath their wings. But there was light. A single window glowed golden in the pre-dawn darkness, warm and steady as a beacon. It spilled out onto the wet cobblestones, painting them amber, and the fog seemed to gather toward it, as if drawn by the promise of warmth within. The light came from a small shop front, narrow and unpretentious, wedged between a tobacconist's establishment and a tailor's premises, both of which remained dark and shuttered. Above the door, a painted sign swayed gently in the morning breeze that had begun to stir the fog. Alderwick and Son, Bakers. The lettering had faded somewhat over the years, the gold leaf dulled to a gentle ochre, and the word son had long since become a memory rather than a fact, but the sign remained, as constant as the tides. Inside, the warmth was immediate and enveloping. Part 2. Flour and quiet hands. The dough beneath Mr. Alderwick's hands had begun its slow transformation. He had set aside the mysterious loaf and returned to the familiar work of the morning's main batch. 6 rounds of dough that would become the bread for the day's customers. They lay before him on the worn wooden table, still covered by the cloth, but he could sense their progress even without seeing them. A baker learns to know such things the way a gardener knows when seeds have taken root beneath the soil, invisible but certain. He lifted the corner of the cloth and peered beneath. Yes, they had risen nicely in the warmth of the bakery, swelling gently, their surfaces now smooth and taut as a baby's skin. He touched one lightly with a flour-dusted finger, and the dough yielded slightly, then slowly pushed back, that particular resilience that told him they were ready for the next stage of their journey. But first, there was more needing to be done. Mr. Alderwick had learned long ago that bread could not be rushed. It required time and patience, and above all, it required the steady, rhythmic work of human hands. Machines might mix and pummel dough more quickly. He had seen such contraptions at the great commercial bakeries that had begun to appear in London, but they could not feel what the dough needed, could not sense the subtle differences in texture that told a true baker when to stop or when to continue. He dusted the table with fresh flour, the white powder settling in a fine cloud that caught the lamplight and made the air shimmer momentarily. The gesture was automatic, performed thousands upon thousands of times over the years, until it had become less a conscious action than a kind of breathing, necessary, rhythmic, essential. Taking the first round of dough, he placed it on the floured surface and began to work it once more. His hands pressed down and forward, the heels of his palms finding the center of the mass and pushing it away from himself. The dough stretched and flattened under the pressure. Then he gathered it back with his fingers, folding it over itself, turning it a quarter turn to the right, and pressing again. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The rhythm was as old as bread itself, unchanged since the first baker had discovered that working the dough in this particular way made it lighter, stronger, better able to hold the air that the yeast would create. The bakery was very quiet now, save for these sounds. The soft slap of dough against wood, the faint creak of the table as he leaned his weight against it, the ever-present whisper of the fire in the oven behind him. Outside, the fog still clung to Pudding Lane, though the darkness had retreated somewhat. The sky beyond the window was no longer black, but rather a deep dark blue, like ink diluted with water, the color that comes just before true dawn. Mr. Alderich's hands moved steadily, without hurry, without hesitation. The dough began to change beneath his touch. At first, it had been merely pliable, but now it was becoming something more. The gluten strands were aligning, forming an invisible network throughout the mass, giving it structure and strength. He could feel this happening, could sense the way the dough was becoming more elastic, more alive. When he pressed it now, it pushed back more firmly. When he stretched it, it resisted more strongly before yielding. This was the mystery and the magic of bread making. This transformation of simple ingredients into something greater than the sum of their parts. Flour, water, salt, yeast, nothing more than that. And yet, in the hands of a skilled baker, they became something that could sustain life, could warm bellies, could bring comfort on cold mornings. His fingers were white with flour dust that had worked its way into every crease and line. Beneath his nails, in the whorls of his fingerprints, coating the fine hairs on the backs of his hands, flour was everywhere, and he had long ago ceased to notice it. It was simply part of him, as much as his own skin. He thought, as he often did while kneading, of his apprentice days. He had been 14 years old when he had first stood at a baker's table, terrified and eager in equal measure. His master then had been a man named Bartholomew Price, a formidable figure with arms like hams and a voice that could shake the rafters when he was displeased. But his hands, when they guided young Thomas through the motions of kneading, had been surprisingly gentle. "Feel it, boy," Mr. Price had said, placing Thomas's small hands on the dough and covering them with his own enormous ones, guiding them through the rhythm. Don't just move your arms like you're pumping water from a well. Feel what the dough is telling you. It will speak if you learn to listen. At first, Thomas had not understood. Dough could not speak. It was merely flour and water, inert and silent. But Mr. Price had been patient, and gradually, over weeks and months and years, Thomas had begun to understand. The dough did speak in its own wordless language. It told him when it needed more water, when it had been worked enough, when it was ready to rest, when it was ready to bake. Now, 40-some years later, his own hands were as skilled as Mr. Price's had been. More skilled, perhaps, for he had been kneading dough nearly every day of his life since that first apprentice morning. His hands knew this work the way a bird knows flight, not through conscious thought, but through something deeper, something written into the very muscles and bones. He finished with the first round and set it aside, covering it again with the cloth. Then he took the second round and began again. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The lamplight flickered slightly as a draft found its way through some gap in the old building. The flame steadied itself and continued to burn, casting Mr. Alderwick's shadow large against the far wall, where it moved in time with his kneading, a dark, gentle giant dancing slowly. The texture of the dough was perfect now. When he pressed a finger into it, the indentation remained for a moment, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to fill back in. Like memory, he thought. Like the way sorrow, pressed into the heart, eventually softens and fades, though it never entirely disappears. He did not often think in such poetic terms, but sometimes, in these quiet morning hours, thoughts came to him that would never have occurred in the bustle of the day. Perhaps it was the solitude, or the meditative rhythm of the work, or simply the peaceful hour before the world fully woke. Whatever the cause, he found a certain comfort in these small contemplations. Third round now, his hands reached for it automatically, placed it on the table, began the familiar motion. The flour dust continued to rise and fall with each movement, creating tiny galaxies of white particles that swirled in the lamplight. Some settled on his apron, on his forearms, on the edge of the table. Some drifted away and settled on the floor, where they would join the accumulated dust of countless other mornings, ground finer and finer by his footsteps, until they became part of the very substance of the bakery itself. There was something deeply satisfying about the repetition. In a world that changed constantly, where buildings were torn down and rebuilt, where people came and went, where even the course of the Thames itself had been altered by the great works of engineers, this remained constant. Bread was made the same way today as it had been made 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. The same ingredients, the same movements, the same patience required. Mr. Alderwick found great comfort in this continuity. He had never been a man who sought novelty or excitement. Even as a young man, he had preferred the steady, predictable rhythm of the baker's life to the adventures that some of his companions had sought. While they had gone off to sea, or joined the army, or tried their fortunes in the new industries that were transforming England, he had remained in London, had learned his trade thoroughly, had eventually taken over this small shop on Pudding Lane when Mr. Price had retired, and he had been happy, was still happy even in his solitude. The fourth round received the same careful attention as the first three. His arms were beginning to feel the pleasant warmth of exertion, not exhaustion, for he was still strong despite his years, but the good, honest tiredness that came from useful work. His shoulders, too, felt the gentle pull of muscles being used, the satisfaction of the body doing what it was meant to do. Outside, the first bird began to sing, a blackbird, by the sound of it, greeting the coming dawn with its liquid, fluting notes. Others would join it soon, the sparrows with their cheerful chirping, the pigeons with their soft cooing, the occasional cry of a gull that had wandered inland from the river. But for now, just the one blackbird and the sound of kneading. Fifth round. The dough was becoming almost silky now under his hands, the surface so smooth that it reflected the lamplight with a subtle sheen. This was how it should be, this perfect balance of structure and softness, of strength and yielding. He could shape it into anything now, rounds or loaves or the plaited bread that some customers preferred for special occasions. But today, simple rounds, honest, straightforward loaves that would serve their purpose without pretension. He thought of the people who would eat this bread, the postman, who came every morning for a small loaf to share with his tea, the seamstress from 2 streets over, who always bought 2 rounds on Mondays to last her through the week, the young clerk who worked at the shipping office and who always seemed perpetually hungry, buying a large loaf that he would tuck under his arm and carry away with evident satisfaction. They relied on him, these regular customers, not in any grand or dramatic way, but in the small, steady way that people rely on the predictable comforts of their daily lives. He provided them with bread, and in doing so, he provided them with something more, with continuity, with reliability, with the knowledge that some things remained constant. 6th and final round. He gave it the same care as all the others, neither rushing because it was the last, nor dawdling because there was no urgency. Each loaf deserved the full measure of his skill and attention. Each loaf would nourish someone, would become part of their body, would give them strength for their day's work. It was a responsibility he had never taken lightly. When the 6th round was properly kneaded, he set it with the others and covered them all again. They would rest now for a time, would continue their slow rising in the warmth of the bakery, and then he would shape them for the final time and slide them into the oven. Mr. Alderwick straightened slowly, feeling the pleasant stretch in his back. He flexed his fingers, dusted his hands together, sending up a small cloud of flour, and looked at his work. 6 rounds of dough rising peacefully beneath their cloth covering, and beyond them, set slightly apart, the mysterious 7th loaf, the one that rose differently, that seemed to glow in the lamplight. He did not touch it yet. It was not ready, somehow. He could sense this, though he could not have explained how he knew. So he left it there and turned his attention to other things. There was the floor to sweep, and the counter to wipe down, and the shelves to prepare for the day's baking. There was always work to be done in a bakery, always some small task waiting. But his hands, as he reached for the broom, still held the memory of the dough, still felt the gentle resistance, the slow yielding, the ancient rhythm. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The rhythm of bread and of life and of quiet morning hours when the world held its breath before beginning again. "Come in, please," Mr. Bellamy said, stepping back and gesturing into the shop. "It is too cold to stand about in doorways. Come in where it is warm, and you can tell me what you need." The girl entered slowly, her eyes growing wide as she took in the shelves of toys surrounding her on all sides. She turned in a slow circle, looking up and around, clearly overwhelmed by the abundance of carved and painted wonders. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she seemed almost afraid to move, as if worried that she might accidentally damage something. "Have you been to my shop before?" Mr. Bellamy asked, returning to his work stool but remaining attentive to his small visitor. The girl shook her head. "No, sir, but I have looked in the window many times. When my mother sends me to the market for vegetables, I always walk this way so I can see the toys. They are very beautiful, sir." "That is kind of you to say," Mr. Bellamy replied. "What is your name, my dear?" "Annie, sir." "Annie Fletcher." "Well, Miss Annie Fletcher, I am Mr. Bellamy, and I am very pleased to make your acquaintance. Now, you were about to ask me something when you were at the door. What was it you wished to know?" Annie's hands twisted together nervously. "I wanted to know, sir, how much a toy would cost. Just a small toy, nothing fine. Only I have been saving my pennies, and I thought perhaps I might have enough." Mr. Bellamy regarded her with gentle attention. That depends on the toy, of course. Different toys cost different amounts. But tell me, is this toy for yourself or for someone else? For my brother, sir, Annie said, her voice becoming slightly stronger now that she was speaking of her purpose. He is only 4, and he has been poorly this winter. A cough that will not leave him. The doctor says he must stay indoors and rest. But he gets so restless and unhappy. I thought if he had a toy, something to play with and imagine with, it might help him pass the time more cheerfully. I see, Mr. Bellamy said, nodding slowly. That is very thoughtful of you, to think of your brother's happiness. What sort of toy were you considering? Annie looked around at the shelves, clearly overwhelmed by the choices. I do not know, sir. Something simple that he could hold in his hands and carry about. He likes animals especially. We saw a horse once when we went to the country to visit our aunt, and he talked of it for weeks afterward. Bellamy rose and moved to one of the shelves, considering the various toys displayed there. How many pennies have you managed to save? He asked. Annie reached into her pocket and produced a small cloth purse, which she opened carefully. She counted the coins onto her palm. 7 pence, sir, she said, a note of pride in her voice. I have been saving for 2 months. I help the greengrocer's wife on Saturday mornings, carrying bundles for the customers, and she gives me 2 each time. And I found a penny in the street once, 7 pence. It was not very much, Mr. Bellamy knew. Most of his toys sold for considerably more. The simpler ones for a shilling or 18 pence, the more elaborate ones for several shillings or even more. But he also knew what it meant for a child to save 2 at a time, to guard those coins carefully and resist the temptation to spend them on sweets or small treats. He scanned the shelves, looking for something appropriate. His eye fell on a small carved horse that he had made some weeks earlier. It was a simple piece, carved from pine, painted brown with a black mane and tail, standing perhaps 4 inches high. He had made it as a practice piece while working out the proportions for a larger commission. And it had no particular destination. The work was good, the proportions were correct, but it was indeed simple compared to some of his more elaborate pieces. He took it down and examined it, turning it in his hands. Yes, this would do nicely. It was small enough for a young child to hold easily, sturdy enough to withstand rough play, and the workmanship was sound even if the design was plain. "What about this?" he asked, showing it to Annie. "Do you think your brother might like it?" Annie's face transformed, lighting with delight. She reached out tentatively, and Mr. Bellamy placed the horse in her hands. She held it carefully, reverently, examining it from all angles. "Oh," she breathed, "it is perfect, sir. It is exactly like the horse we saw. He will love it, I know he will. But," her expression fell slightly, "how much does it cost, sir?" Mr. Bellamy appeared to consider the question carefully, though in truth, he had already made his decision. "Well," he said slowly, "it is a simple piece, as you can see. Not as elaborate as some of my work. I should think 7 pence would be a fair price for such a toy." Annie's eyes widened. "Truly, sir? You would sell it for exactly what I have?" "I would indeed," Mr. Bellamy said. "It seems to me that a toy is worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for it. And you have clearly worked hard to save your 7 pence. That makes the horse worth precisely that amount." Annie's eyes had become bright with tears that she was clearly fighting to hold back. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you so very much." "You are very kind." She counted out her 7 coins onto the workbench, placing each one carefully as if it were something precious. Mr. Bellamy accepted them and placed them in his cash box, then took a piece of brown paper and wrapped the horse carefully, tying it with string. "There," he said, handing her the package. "That should keep it safe on your journey home. Give your brother my best wishes for a swift recovery, and tell him that this horse is very brave and will go on many adventures with him." Annie clutched the package to her chest, her face glowing with happiness. "I will, sir. I will tell him he is going to be so pleased. He has been so sad, lying in bed day after day. This will cheer him. I know it will." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Sir, you are the kindest man I have ever met. When I am grown and have money of my own, I shall come back and buy more toys from you, the finest ones you have, and I shall give them to children who need them. I promise." Mr. Bellamy felt a warmth spread through his chest, a tightness in his throat. "That is a fine ambition, Miss Fletcher. I hope you will be able to fulfill it. But for now, hurry home to your brother. The day is cold, and you should not be out longer than necessary." Annie nodded and slipped out the door, but not before favoring him with one more brilliant smile. He watched through the window as she walked away down the street, the wrapped package held carefully in both hands, her step considerably lighter than it had been when she arrived. When she had disappeared around the corner, Mr. Bellamy returned to his workbench and opened the cash box, looking at the 7 pennies Annie had given him. They represented 2 months of Saturday morning labor, of carrying bundles and being patient with demanding customers, of resisting the temptation to spend the slowly accumulating coins. They represented a sister's love for her ailing brother, a desire to bring comfort and joy to someone who was suffering. He closed the cash box and returned to his painting, but his mind was not on the yellow duck before him. He was thinking, instead of a small boy lying in bed, coughing and restless and unhappy, and of the moment when his sister would return home and present him with the wrapped package, of the joy that would light his face when he unwrapped it and saw the little brown horse, of the adventures they would have together, galloping across the blankets, jumping over pillows, racing to imaginary destinations. He returned to his workbench and sat down, his hands coming to rest on the piece of wood he had been carving the previous afternoon. A bear's head, still rough, requiring much more work before it would be ready for painting. He picked up his carving knife, but did not immediately begin to work. Instead, he held it quietly, thinking about all the toys this knife had helped to create over the years, all the small wooden forms it had helped to coax forth from blocks of lime or cherry or oak. His father's hands had guided this knife before his own. His father had carved with it, had shaped toy after toy, had invested each one with care and attention. And now Mr. Bellamy's hands performed the same work, following the same principles, creating for a new generation of children the same kinds of companions his father had created for an earlier generation. There was comfort in this continuity, in being part of a tradition that stretched backward and forward through time. He was not merely an individual craftsman working in isolation. He was a link in a chain, receiving skills and knowledge from those who had come before and passing them on, if only through the toys themselves, to those who would come after. What would become of his workshop when he was gone? He had no children to inherit it, no apprentice to carry on the work. Likely the shop would be cleared out, his tools sold or discarded, his remaining stock of toys distributed somehow. The building would be taken over by some other business. and the long history of toy making in this location would come to an end. The thought saddened him, but only mildly. Everything ended eventually. Workshops closed, traditions faded, skills were lost or transformed. This was the nature of time, of change, of the world's constant movement forward. He had done his work, had made his toys, had contributed what he could contribute. That would have to be enough. And yet, some of his toys would survive him, would continue to exist and be played with and loved. In that sense, something of him would persist. Not his name, perhaps, not his identity, but his care, his craftsmanship, the love he had invested in his work. These things would endure in the toys themselves, invisible but present, a kind of gift given to children he would never meet, in times he would never see. Mr. Bellamy lifted his knife and began to work on the bear's head, the blade moving in its familiar rhythms, the wood shavings beginning to accumulate on the bench before him. As he carved, his mind grew quiet, focused on the immediate task, on the feel of the wood and the angle of the blade. But beneath that focused attention, beneath the conscious thought required by the work, there ran a current of deeper feeling, a sense of connection to all the other toy makers who had ever lived, all the other craftspeople who had devoted their lives to creating things of beauty and utility for others. He was not alone. Even in his solitary workshop, he was part of something larger, something that transcended individual lives and connected hands across time. The morning light grew gradually brighter, the street sounds increased, the day began in earnest, and Mr. Arthur Bellamy worked on, his hands shaping wood, his mind holding gently the awareness of memory and meaning, creating with patience and care the small wooden companions that would carry forward, in their quiet way, into an unknown future. The Toy Maker of Covent Garden. Part 7. Evening light in the workshop. The afternoon had worn on in its quiet way, and now the light was changing, taking on the particular quality that comes in the hour before sunset. Mr. Bellamy paused in his work and looked toward the window, where the gray sky of morning had transformed into something softer. Warmer bands of pale gold and rose visible between the rooftops, the clouds catching the fading sun and holding its light like precious things cupped in careful hands. He set down the small paintbrush he had been using. He had been adding delicate details to a toy theater, tiny flowers painted on the proscenium arch, and rose from his stool, moving to the window to better see the sky. The street outside was quieter now than it had been earlier in the day. The market had closed, the vendors had packed their barrows and gone home, and only a few pedestrians remained, hurrying toward their own suppers and firesides. The light from the setting sun slanted through the window at a low angle, illuminating the dust motes that drifted through the air and casting long shadows across the workshop floor. It touched the toys on their shelves, making the painted surfaces glow softly, bringing out depths of color that had not been visible in the flat light of midday. A wooden horse caught the light and seemed almost to shimmer. A row of tin soldiers stood in formation, their painted uniforms brilliant for this brief moment before the light faded entirely. Mr. Bellamy stood at the window, simply watching as the sky continued its slow transformation. This was one of his favorite times of day, this transition from afternoon to evening, when the world grew quiet and the light became beautiful, and there was a sense of things settling, of the day's work drawing toward its close. Behind him, the lamps in his workshop glowed steadily, their warm yellow light a counterpoint to the cooler light from outside. He had lit them an hour ago, when the afternoon had begun to dim, and now they created a space of warmth and comfort that felt increasingly separate from the darkening street beyond the window. The workshop was becoming an island of light, a haven against the approaching night. He turned from the window and surveyed his domain. The workbench held the projects he had been engaged with throughout the day. The toy theater with its half-painted flowers, a set of building blocks awaiting their final coat of varnish. A partially carved figure that would eventually become a shepherd for a nativity scene. Each piece represented hours of careful work, and each would require more hours still before it was complete. But there was no hurry. The work would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Mr. Bellamy moved to the small spirit stove in the corner and set the kettle to boil for his evening tea. This, too, was part of the ritual of his days. This pause, as afternoon became evening. This moment of rest and reflection before the final hours of work that would carry him to closing time. While the water heated, he tidied his workbench, arranging tools, wiping down surfaces, sweeping the accumulated wood shavings and paint scrapings into his dustpan. The workshop was never completely clean. Sawdust seemed to generate itself, appearing in corners and crevices no matter how often he swept. But he liked to maintain a certain level of order to ensure that his workspace was ready for the next day's labor. The kettle began to sing, its whistle soft and almost musical, in the quiet workshop. Mr. Bellamy prepared his tea with the same methodical care he brought to all his tasks, warming the pot, measuring the leaves, pouring the water, allowing it to steep while he fetched a cup and saucer from the small shelf where he kept such things. He poured the tea when it was ready, added a small amount of milk from the jug he had brought down from his rooms that morning, and carried the cup to his chair near the fire. The fire had burned low during the afternoon, and he added a few pieces of coal to it now, watching as they caught and began to glow, sending up small flames that danced and flickered in the grate. Settling into his chair, tea in hand, Mr. Bellamy allowed himself to simply sit for a while, doing nothing, thinking nothing in particular, merely existing in this moment of quietness and rest. Outside, the sunset continued its slow progression, the colors in the sky deepening from pale gold and rose to richer shades of amber and crimson. The street lamps were being lit. He could see the lamplighter passing by, his familiar figure bent to his task, each lamp blooming into light as he touched it with his long pole. The sounds from outside were fading now. A cart rumbled past, its wheels making their familiar rumble on the cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. 6 chimes, clear and measured. A dog barked, the sound carrying in the cooling air, but these sounds were growing fewer, softer, as if the city itself were settling down for the evening, drawing breath before the night. Mr. Bellamy sipped his tea and felt the warmth spread through him. The day had been a good one, not remarkable, not particularly eventful, but good in the way that simple days of honest work are good. He had made progress on several projects, had kept his workspace in order, had tended to the small details that required attention. There was satisfaction in this, in the accumulation of small accomplishments, in the steady forward movement of his craft. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the ceiling. The lamps burned with their steady, unwavering light. The toys on their shelves stood silent and patient, each one holding its particular character, its own small presence. The rocking horse seemed poised to move if only someone would climb onto its back. The dolls sat or stood in various attitudes, their painted faces serene. The soldiers maintained their eternal formation, ready for campaigns that would be fought only in imagination. Mr. Bellamy thought about all the evenings he had spent in this chair, in this workshop, over all the years of his working life. Thousands of evenings, each one much like this one, each one bringing its own particular quality of light and shadow, its own configuration of sounds from the street outside, its own texture of thoughts and feelings, and yet each one unique, unrepeatable, a moment that would come once and never again. There was something both melancholy and comforting in this awareness. Melancholy because it was a reminder of time's passage, of the way days accumulated into years and years into a lifetime, of the fact that he was old now and would not have infinitely many more such evenings. Comforting because it made each evening precious, made this moment of sitting with his tea by the fire something to be appreciated, to be fully inhabited rather than rushed through on the way to something else. He finished his tea and set the cup aside, then simply sat, watching the fire, listening to the quiet sounds of the workshop, the soft ticking of the clock, the occasional settling of coals in the grate, the faint creaking of the building as it adjusted to the cooling evening air. The sky outside had darkened further now, the sunset colors fading into deep blue and purple. The street lamps provided the primary illumination, their light making small pools on the pavement, leaving the spaces between in shadow. A few people still passed by, their figures briefly visible as they moved through the lamplight, then disappearing again into darkness. Mr. Bellamy rose from his chair and moved about the workshop, adjusting a lamp here, straightening a tool there, his movements slow and contemplative. He paused before the shelf where the cloth doll and his childhood soldier stood together and reached up to adjust the doll's faded blue dress, which had become slightly disarranged. The doll's painted face looked back at him, peaceful and patient, and he felt a surge of affection for this old toy that had survived so much, that held within its worn fabric such a weight of memory and meaning. "Good evening," he said softly to the doll and to the soldier beside it, and perhaps to all the other toys on all the other shelves, each one waiting for its moment, each one ready to bring joy or comfort to whatever child would eventually claim it. He returned to his workbench and took up the toy theater again, examining it in the lamplight. The painted flowers on the proscenium arch were nearly complete. A few more touches, and they would be finished. He picked up his smallest brush, dipped it carefully in paint, and began to add the final details, working slowly and precisely, his hand steady despite his years. As he worked, the evening deepened into night. The last traces of sunset faded from the sky. The street outside grew quieter still, the sounds becoming more occasional, more distant. Inside the workshop, the lamps burned on, creating a warm cocoon of light against the darkness beyond the windows. Mr. Bellamy worked without hurrying, adding tiny touches of color to the theater's painted decorations, losing himself in the meditative rhythm of the work. The brush moved across the wood surface with delicate precision, leaving behind trails of paint that caught the lamplight and glowed softly. Each stroke was deliberate, considered, the product of years of practice, and an attention that had become almost instinctive. Time passed, marked only by the steady ticking of the clock and the gradual transformation of the toy theater from nearly finished to complete. When the last flower was painted and the last detail added, Mr. Bellamy set down his brush and held the theater up to the light, turning it slowly, examining his work from all angles. It was good. The proportions were correct. The painting was careful and precise. The whole piece had the quality of rightness that came when craft and care combined successfully. Some child would receive this theater and would put on plays with it, would create stories and performances, would populate its small stage with imagination and wonder. He set the theater aside to dry and cleaned his brushes carefully, washing away the paint with turpentine and then water, drying them on a soft cloth, returning them to their jar. The workbench was tidied, tools put away, surfaces wiped clean. The day's work was done. Mr. Bellamy stood in the center of his workshop, looking around at the space that had been the center of his life for so many years. The lamps cast their warm light across familiar surfaces. The fire had settled into a steady glow. The toys on their shelves waited patiently. And outside, beyond the windows, the night had fully arrived, wrapping the city in darkness, while here, in this small shop in Covent Garden, warmth and light persisted, a small refuge against the dark. He felt peaceful, content, ready for the evening's remaining hours and whatever they might bring. The day had been good, the work had been satisfying, and now the night was here, bringing with it the promise of rest and the certainty that tomorrow would bring another day, another morning, another opportunity to continue the quiet work of creating small vessels of joy from wood and paint and imagination. Part 8. A Visitor from Long Ago. The next afternoon brought with it a visitor that Mr. Bellamy had not expected, though in truth he welcomed very few visitors and expected even fewer. He was at his workbench, engaged in the delicate work of attaching the tiny brass hinges to a wooden music box, when he heard the soft tapping at his door. 3 gentle knocks, patient and unhurried. He set down his tools and rose, crossing the workshop to answer. When he opened the door, he found standing there an elderly woman, perhaps a few years younger than himself, dressed in clothing that spoke of genteel poverty, good fabric, and careful maintenance, but styles that were no longer quite fashionable, colors that had faded with many washings. Her face was deeply lined but kind, and her eyes held a quality of gentle determination mixed with uncertainty. "Mr. Bellamy?" she asked, her voice soft and cultured. "I hope I am not intruding. I wonder if I might speak with you for a few moments." "Of course," Mr. Bellamy said, stepping back to allow her entrance. "Please, do come in. How may I be of service to you?" The woman entered slowly, looking around the workshop with an expression that seemed to combine nostalgia with something approaching wonder. "It has been many years since I was last in this shop," she said quietly. "Many years indeed. I was not certain I would find it still here, still unchanged." Mr. Bellamy studied her face, trying to place her, but the memory would not come. "I apologize," he said. "I fear my memory is not what it once was. Have we met before?" "We have," the woman said, "though it was a very long time ago. More than 20 years, I should think. My name is Mary Thornton then. I am Mrs. Mary Ashford now, these past 15 years. But you would have known me as Mary Thornton." Mary Thornton. The name stirred something in Mr. Bellamy's memory, a distant recognition. And then, quite suddenly, understanding came. "You are the daughter of Mrs. Millicent Thornton," he said softly. "The first Mary." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "You remember?" she said, her voice touched with emotion. "After all these years, you remember." "I remember your mother bringing a doll to be repaired," Mr. Bellamy said. "A cloth doll in a blue dress. She said it had been yours when you were a child, and that your daughter, also named Mary, had inherited it and loved it dearly. Mrs. Ashford nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, that is right. My daughter Mary. She died when she was 8 years old, not long after my mother brought the doll here for repair. A fever that came suddenly and could not be broken. It has been more than 20 years now, but..." She paused, pressing her lips together, composing herself. "Time softens the grief, but it never quite removes it." "I am so very sorry," Mr. Bellamy said gently. "Please, come and sit down. May I offer you some tea?" Mrs. Ashford accepted gratefully, and Mr. Bellamy busied himself with preparing tea while his visitor settled into the chair near the fire. As the water heated, he found himself thinking about the connections between the past and present, about how lives touched and separated, and sometimes, unexpectedly, touched again. When the tea was ready, he poured 2 cups and carried them to the fireside, settling into the second chair with a slight sigh of relief. His knees had been bothering him today, and sitting was more comfortable than standing. "I have thought about this shop many times over the years," Mrs. Ashford said, accepting her tea with a small nod of thanks. "After my daughter died, my mother brought the doll back to you. She could not bear to keep it, you see. Every time she saw it, she thought of Mary, and the pain was too great. She asked if you would keep it here, and you agreed, out of kindness. I have always remembered that kindness." "It was a small thing," Mr. Bellamy said. "Your mother was grieving. How could I refuse such a request?" "Many would have," Mrs. Ashford said, "but you did not. And now, well, I have come to ask about the doll. My mother died 3 years ago, and before she passed, she spoke of it. She said she had been wrong to give it away, that it should have remained in the family, that it held too much memory to be abandoned. She asked me to try to retrieve it if it still existed. I know it is a great deal to ask after so many years, but I wondered." Mr. Bellamy set down his teacup and rose. He crossed to the shelf where the cloth doll stood beside his childhood soldier and carefully lifted it down. He carried it back to Mrs. Ashford and held it out to her. "It is here," he said simply. "It has been waiting." Mrs. Ashford took the doll with trembling hands, and the tears that had been gathering in her eyes spilled over. She held the doll close to her chest, much as a child might hold it, and wept quietly for several moments. Mr. Bellamy sat in respectful silence, allowing her the space to feel what she needed to feel. When she had composed herself, Mrs. Ashford looked at the doll more carefully, examining it as one might examine an old friend, not seen in many years. "It is exactly as I remember," she said wonderingly. "The blue dress, the painted face, the yarn hair. I made this doll myself, you know, when I was perhaps 14 or 15. I was learning to sew, and my mother suggested I make a doll as practice. I remember choosing the fabric for the dress, painting the face with such care, and then I gave it to my own daughter when she was small, and she loved it just as I had loved it. It shows the signs of much love," Mr. Bellamy said gently. "That is the best thing one can say about a toy." Mrs. Ashford nodded, running her fingers over the doll's faded dress. "I embroidered my initials on the back," she said. "M.T. Mary Thornton, as I was then. I wanted to mark it as mine, to claim it somehow. How foolish and how young I was. We all wish to leave our mark, to say I was here, I made this, I mattered. There was nothing foolish in that." Mr. Bellamy walked her to the door, moving slowly, feeling the weight of the day and the years in his bones. At the threshold, Mrs. Ashford paused and turned to him. "We live such brief lives," she said quietly, "and yet the things we make, the love we give, these can endure. My mother made this doll for me. I gave it to my daughter. Now I give it to my granddaughter. And perhaps someday she will give it to her own daughter. The people may pass away, but the love remains, held in cloth and paint and memory." "That is a beautiful thought," Mr. Bellamy said. "I hope it proves true." They said their farewells, and Mr. Bellamy watched from the doorway as Mrs. Ashford made her way down the street, the basket with its precious contents held carefully in her hands. She walked slowly but with evident purpose, and he continued watching until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. He closed the door and returned to his workshop, feeling a mixture of emotions he could not quite name. Sadness for the loss of the doll, which had become a familiar presence during its years on his shelf, but also deep satisfaction that it was returning to the family that had created it, that it would know the hands of another child, that its story would continue. He looked at the shelf where the doll had stood, now holding only his childhood soldier. The soldier seemed somehow lonely without its companion, standing at attention in solitary vigil. Mr. Bellamy reached up and adjusted the soldier's position slightly, turning it so that it faced outward toward the workshop rather than toward the wall. "You are the keeper of memories now," he said softly to the small wooden figure. "You must remember for both of you." The afternoon continued its quiet progression toward evening, and Mr. Bellamy returned to his work, his hands taking up familiar tools, his mind holding gently the awareness that he had been witness to something significant, not grand or dramatic, but meaningful in the way that small acts of preservation and return are meaningful, in the way that connections across time and loss can sometimes be unexpectedly restored. Outside, the street grew gradually darker, the sounds of commerce fading into the quieter sounds of evening. Inside, the lamps burned steadily, the fire glowed in its grate, and the work continued, patient and unhurried, as it had for decades and would continue for as long as strength remained. Life moved in its cycles, loss and recovery, separation and reunion, endings and beginnings. And through it all, the small things persisted. A wooden soldier on a shelf, a cloth doll returning home, the steady work of hands creating toys for children who would love them, lose them, remember them, and perhaps, if fortune smiled, find them again when they were most needed. Part 9. Closing the workshop. The evening had settled fully over Covent Garden by the time Mr. Bellamy began his preparations for closing the shop. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 7:30, and though there was work he could still do, there was also the recognition that his body was tired, that his eyes were growing weary from the close work of the day, that it was time to bring this day to its conclusion and allow himself the rest he had earned. He stood in the center of his workshop, looking around at the familiar space with the appreciation that comes from long association. The lamps cast their warm light across the workbench, across the shelves of toys, across the tools that hung on their pegs or rested in their designated places. Everything was much as it had been that morning, and yet subtly different. The work had progressed. Pieces had moved from one stage of completion to the next. The day had left its mark in small ways. Mr. Bellamy began with the fire, as he always did. It had burned low during the evening, and now consisted mostly of glowing coals and fine ash. He took the poker and carefully spread the coals evenly across the grate, then covered them with ash from the bucket, enough to bank the fire safely. to preserve a small core of heat that could be revived in the morning, but not so much as to completely smother it. The fire's light dimmed as he worked, the red glow gradually being obscured by the gray ash until only the faintest suggestion of warmth remained visible. Next, he turned his attention to his workbench. The music box he had been working on earlier lay there, its tiny brass hinges now properly attached, waiting only for its mechanism to be installed. He examined it once more in the lamplight, checking that the hinges moved smoothly, that the joints were secure, that everything was as it should be. Satisfied, he set it aside carefully, placing it on a shelf where it would be safe until he could return to it tomorrow. The rest of the workbench required tidying. He gathered the small brass screws that had not been used and returned them to their compartmented box. The screwdriver was wiped clean and returned to its place in the tool rack. The fine sandpaper he had used to smooth the wood around the hinges was folded neatly and set aside for future use. Each action was deliberate, unhurried, part of the ritual that marked the transition from work to rest. He moved methodically around the workshop, attending to each area in turn. The paintbrushes were checked to ensure they had been properly cleaned. He had washed them earlier, but it was his habit to check again, for a brush left with dried paint in its bristles was a brush ruined. He found them all clean and soft, standing in their jar like a small forest of wooden handles and fine bristles. The pots of paint were examined to ensure their lids were tight. He had learned long ago that paint left exposed to air would dry and become useless, and he was meticulous about sealing each pot after use. He found one lid that was slightly loose and tightened it, then arranged all the pots in their proper order on the shelf: reds and blues and yellows and greens and browns, each one labeled in his careful handwriting. The carving knives required special attention. Each one was examined for cleanliness, for any trace of wood sap or resin that might have accumulated on the blade. He found them all satisfactory, but he nevertheless wiped each one with a lightly oiled cloth, maintaining the steel, preventing rust, ensuring they would be ready when next he needed them. Then each knife was returned to its place in the wooden rack, arranged by size and purpose, the way his father had taught him, the way his grandfather had taught his father. Rest now. The toys keep their watch. The darkness holds all things gently, and the night moves on, carrying its cargo of silence and stillness toward the distant shore of morning. Rest. All is well. All is safe. All things wait, patient and peaceful, for the return of light. Sleep. Tonight, I invite you to a narrow, cobbled street in the old city of York, where the fog drifts softly between the buildings and a single candle glows in the window of a small shop. It is the workshop of a candle maker, a place filled with the scent of warm wax, gentle light, and the quiet weight of passing years. But on one of the shelves, there is a candle that always burns a little longer than the rest, and each evening, the old candle maker notices it, yet never blows it out. Before the story begins, stay here with me for just a moment. Watch the soft flicker of the flame and let this quiet workshop carry you slowly toward sleep. Part 1. The Candlemaker's Window. The fog came early to York that morning, as it so often did in the weeks before Christmas, settling upon the ancient streets like a soft woolen blanket drawn up by invisible hands. It crept along the worn cobblestones of Stonegate, curling around the corners of timber-framed buildings that had stood sentinel for 300 years or more, their upper stories leaning companionably toward one another across the narrow thoroughfare, as though sharing whispered confidences in the gray dawn. In the stillness before the city properly woke, Before the clatter of cartwheels and the calls of merchants broke the silence, there was only the muffled sound of footsteps here and there, a baker making his way to his ovens, a lamplighter completing his rounds, extinguishing the gas lamps one by one, as the pale winter light began its slow ascent behind the cathedral towers. And there, halfway down the street, in a building no wider than 2 windows and a door, a single point of golden light pierced the fog. It glowed steadily in the window of a small shop, warm and constant, as though it had been burning all through the night. The light caught the frost that had formed on the outside of the glass, transforming each crystalline pattern into something precious and delicate. It illuminated the painted lettering above the door, letters that had faded somewhat over the years, but could still be read by those who knew to look. Halbrook and Son, Chandlers, established 1823. The and Son had not been true for many years now. Inside the shop, the air was thick with the sweet honeyed scent of beeswax mingled with the faint smokiness of tallow and the clean sharpness of new cotton wick. The walls were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and upon those shelves stood candles of every conceivable size and shape. Tall tapers for dining tables stood like soldiers in their wooden boxes. Squat, sturdy candles for lanterns nestled in rows. Delicate votives, no bigger than a thimble, weighted in paper wrappings. And larger pillar candles, substantial and serious, occupied the middle shelves with an air of quiet dignity. The single candle that had been burning through the night stood upon the counter near the window, its flame steady and unwavering, despite the drafts that found their way through the old building's many cracks and crevices. It was not an especially large candle, nor was it particularly ornate. It was made of good beeswax, pale gold in color, with a simplicity of form that spoke more eloquently than any decoration might have done. As the church bells of York Minster began to toll 6 o'clock, their deep voices rolling across the rooftops and chimney pots, a door at the back of the shop opened, and an elderly man emerged into the golden half-light of the workshop. Mr. Edwin Halbrook moved slowly, as befitted a man in his 73rd year, but there was nothing feeble in his movements. He carried himself with the careful precision of one who had spent a lifetime working with hot wax and open flame, where haste could mean burnt fingers or ruined work. His hair, what remained of it, formed a silver halo around his head in the candlelight. He wore a wool waistcoat over his shirt and an apron, much mended and bearing the stains of countless candles, was already tied about his waist, for he had put it on before even making his tea, as was his habit. He paused for a moment in the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness, though he knew every inch of this room as well as he knew the lines of his own hands. Then he moved forward into the shop with the quiet confidence of long familiarity. His first task, as it had been for more years than he cared to count, was to unlock the front door. Not to open it, that would come later, when the fog had lifted somewhat and the street had fully awakened, but simply to unlock it. It was a ritual, a way of telling himself that the day had begun, that the night's solitude had ended, and that the world, with all its small necessities and gentle rhythms, was ready to receive him once more. The key turned in the lock with a soft click that seemed loud in the morning quiet. Mr. Halbrook returned to the counter and began the work that had shaped his days for as long as he could remember. He took up a small pair of scissors, their handles worn smooth by decades of use, and began trimming the wicks of the candles that would burn in the shop that day. Each wick required attention. Too long, and the candle would smoke and sputter. Too short, and the flame would drown in melted wax. It was a small thing, this trimming, but Mr. Halbrook had long ago learned that the world was built of small things done with care. Snip, snip, snip. The sound was rhythmic and soothing, punctuated only by the gentle settling of the building around him and the distant call of a crow somewhere beyond the fog. He worked his way along the counter, then to the shelves, lighting candles as he went. Not all of them, that would have been wasteful. And Mr. Halbrook was not a wasteful man, but enough to fill the shop with a warm, welcoming glow. He used a long taper for the purpose, lighting it from the candle on the counter and then carrying the flame carefully from wick to wick. As each new candle caught and bloomed into light, the shop transformed. Shadows retreated into the corners. The grain of the wooden shelves became visible, rich and warm. The brass scales on the counter gleamed softly. And in the window, the candles arranged for display began to glow like a constellation of small earthbound stars. Mr. Halbrook stepped back to survey his work, as he always did, ensuring that the shop looked as it should. His eyes traveled across the familiar landscape of shelves and stock, of tools and materials, of the accumulated evidence of a life spent in quiet making. And then, as his gaze reached the highest shelf on the wall behind the counter, he paused. There, slightly apart from the others, stood a single candle. It was not the largest candle in the shop, nor the most beautiful, though it possessed a beauty of its own, a simple, unadorned pillar of pale beeswax that seemed to hold the light with interest. Mr. Halbrook could not have said with certainty how long that particular candle had been there. Years, certainly, perhaps a decade or more. What he could say, what he had noticed season after season, year after year, was that it burned longer than any candle had a right to burn. He had lit it, of course, many times. When the shop grew particularly cold, or when he worked late into the evening and needed the company of light, and it burned as any candle would burn, with a steady golden flame. But it never seemed to diminish, or if it did diminish, it did so with such exceeding slowness that the change escaped notice. The candle stood at the same height, maintained the same dignity of form year after year, as though time itself had agreed to pass it by. Mr. Halbrook did not dwell on this mystery overmuch. He was not a fanciful man. The world, in his experience, contained enough genuine wonder in the way light moved through wax, in the precise moment when liquid became solid, in the mathematics of wick and flame, that he felt no need to invent more. If the candle burned longer than seemed natural, well, perhaps he had made it especially well. Perhaps the wax had been particularly pure, the wick particularly true, or perhaps, and here a small smile touched his lips, perhaps some mysteries were content to remain mysterious, and that was perfectly acceptable. He turned away from the high shelf and moved to the small window at the back of his shop, drawing aside the curtain to look out into the yard beyond. The fog was beginning to thin, just slightly, and he could make out the shapes of the neighboring buildings, the dark line of the wall that separated one property from another, the bare branches of the tree that grew in Mrs. Pemberton's garden next door. It would be a quiet day, he suspected. The fog would keep many people at home, but there would be visitors nonetheless. There always were. Someone would need candles for their church. Someone else would want a good light for reading. Perhaps young Thomas from the bookshop would come by for the tapers he preferred for his late-night studying. Mr. Halbrook returned to the front of the shop and settled himself on the tall stool behind the counter. He had an hour, perhaps, before anyone would knock at the door. Time enough for a cup of tea. Time enough to watch the morning light strengthen. Time enough to simply sit in the company of candlelight and silence, two things of which he had never grown tired. The candle on the counter continued to burn. its flame painting slow, wandering shadows on the ceiling above. Outside, York was waking. Somewhere, a door opened and closed. Voices called out greetings. The city was remembering itself, shaking off the night's dreams, preparing for the day's work. But here, in the small shop on Stonegate, time moved differently. Here, the day began as it always had, with light chasing back darkness, with small rituals performed with care, with the quiet knowledge that some things, warmth, welcome, the steady burning of a good candle, remained constant in a world much given to change. Mr. Halbrook drew a breath, feeling the warmth of the shop settle around him like an embrace. Outside, the fog would lift. Customers would come, work would be done. But for now, in this moment, there was only the gentle glow of candlelight, the sweet smell of beeswax, and the peaceful certainty of another day beginning as it should. The candle on the high shelf, the one that burned longer than it ought, remained where it had always been, keeping its quiet vigil, holding its small mystery close. And in the window, the golden light continued to shine, a beacon for anyone who might be walking through the fog, a promise of warmth and welcome in the gray December morning. Part 2. Wax, Wick, and Quiet Hands. The morning tea had been drunk, the cup rinsed and set aside, and now Mr. Halbrook turned his attention to the work that would occupy the greater part of his day. In the room behind the shop, a space that served as both workshop and storeroom, the tools of his trade awaited him with the patient silence of inanimate things that know they will be needed. He moved through the narrow doorway, ducking his head slightly, though the passage was tall enough, a habit formed over long years when his back had been straighter and the world a fraction larger. The workshop was smaller than the shop itself, but it possessed a completeness that the front room lacked. Here was where the true work happened, where formless wax became light, where the alchemy of his craft transformed simple materials into something useful and good. The table that dominated the center of the room bore the marks of decades of labor. Its surface was scarred and stained, darkened in places where hot wax had spilled and cooled, lighter in others where his hands had worn the wood smooth through endless repetition. Along one wall stood shelves holding blocks of beeswax, their surfaces dull gold in the dim light. Beside them, wrapped in cloth, were stores of tallow, less expensive, less fragrant, but necessary nonetheless for those customers whose purses could not stretch to beeswax. Mr. Halbrook ran his hand along the edge of the table, a gesture of greeting, of acknowledgement. Then he set about preparing his workspace with the methodical care that had become second nature. First, the fire. The small stove in the corner needed tending, its embers from the night before stirred to life and fed with carefully chosen pieces of coal. Not too much. The heat must be steady and even, not fierce. Wax was a delicate thing, for all its seeming solidity. Too much heat, and it would scorch, turning bitter and dark. Too little, and it would never properly melt, remaining thick and unworkable. He worked the bellows gently, coaxing the fire to a steady glow. The warmth began to spread through the small room, chasing away the morning chill that had settled in the corners. Mr. Halbrook could feel it on his face, on his hands, a warmth that spoke of work about to begin, of purpose about to be fulfilled. While the stove heated, he selected the wax he would work with today. His hands moved over the blocks with assurance, choosing 3, all beeswax, for he had an order to fill for the cathedral, and they would accept nothing less. The wax was cool and firm beneath his fingers, its surface slightly rough. He could smell it even before heating, that characteristic scent of honey and summer meadows, of flowers and industry, and the patient work of bees. He broke the blocks into smaller pieces using a broad-bladed knife, the wax fracturing along natural lines with satisfying cracks. The pieces went into a large copper pot, one that his father had used, and his father's father before that. The pot was burnished to a soft glow, its bottom darkened by years of heat, its handle wrapped in leather that had molded itself to the shape of hands, now long since. Still, Mr. Halbrook set the pot on the stove and watched as the wax began its transformation. It happened slowly, as all good things do. At first, nothing seemed to change. The pieces of wax sat in the pot, apparently impervious to the heat below. But if one watched closely, and Mr. Halbrook always watched closely, one could see the moment when the wax began to surrender. A faint sheen appeared on the surface of the pieces. The edges softened, grew rounded, and then, almost imperceptibly at first, the solid began to flow. It melted from the bottom up, turning liquid gold, pooling in the base of the pot and slowly climbing the sides of the pieces that remained solid. Mr. Halbrook stirred gently with a wooden paddle, helping the process along, watching as piece after piece yielded to the heat and became part of the whole. The smell intensified as the wax melted, sweet and warm and infinitely comforting, filling the workshop and seeping through into the shop beyond. It was the smell of his childhood, of watching his father work, of learning that patience and attention were worth more than haste and force. It was the smell of countless quiet mornings, just like this, one of work done well, of craft practiced with care. When the wax was fully melted, Mr. Halbrook removed the pot from direct heat and set it on a trivet to cool slightly. Wax that was too hot would not hold a wick properly, would burn the cotton and make for a poor candle. It needed to cool to just the right temperature, hot enough to coat and penetrate, cool enough to begin setting almost immediately. While he waited, he prepared the wicks. They hung in bundles from hooks on the wall, long strands of braided cotton, clean and white and ready. Mr. Halbrook took down a bundle and cut it into lengths appropriate for the tapers he would make today. Each cut was measured not with a rule, but with his eye, an eye that had made this judgment so many thousands of times that it no longer required conscious thought. His hands simply knew. He arranged the cut wicks on the table, laying them out parallel to one another, straight and neat. Disorder in the beginning led to disorder in the end. And Mr. Halbrook had no patience for disorder, not from irritation. He was not an irritable man, but from the simple understanding that his craft deserved better. Outside, the fog had lifted somewhat, and through the high window of the workshop, a pale gray light filtered down. It mingled with a warmer light from the candles he had lit earlier, creating a soft illumination that was neither holy daylight nor holy candlelight, but something in between, a gentle diffused glow that seemed to suit the quiet work of the morning. Mr. Halbrook tested the wax with one finger, pressing lightly against the surface. It was ready. That particular warmth, that particular consistency, these were things he knew in his bones, knowledge accumulated through years of daily practice until it became instinct. He took up the first wick and dipped it into the wax. The process was simple. Lower the wick into the pot, immersing it completely. Lift it out. Wait. The wax that coated the wick would cool and harden, creating a thin layer, then dip again and again and again, layer upon layer, each one adding infinitesimal thickness, each one building toward the final form. Dip, lift, wait. Dip, lift, wait. The rhythm of it was hypnotic, meditative. There was no rushing this work. Each layer needed time to cool before the next could be added, or else the accumulated wax would simply slide off, wasted. So, Mr. Halbrook dipped in rotation, working his way through the dozen wicks he had prepared, giving each its turn, returning to the first just as it was ready for another layer. The children love candles. Still, Mrs. Ashworth said after a moment, at Christmas, when we light the ones on our classroom tree, they become quite reverent. Even the rowdiest boys fall silent. There's something about a candle flame that speaks to something deep in us, I think. Something ancient and essential. Fire was our first technology, Mr. Halbrook observed. Before tools, before language perhaps. The first thing we learned to carry with us, to create on demand. Light and warmth and safety, all in one small flame. We've been watching fires burn for as long as we've been human. It's no wonder it still speaks to us. You're quite the philosopher, Mr. Halbrook, Mrs. Ashworth said with a gentle smile. Not at all, he replied, a little embarrassed. Merely an old man who has spent too much time alone with his thoughts and his candles. I think perhaps candles make philosophers of us all, Mrs. Ashworth said. They burn quietly and steadily, and they invite us to do the same. The conversation drifted then to other matters. How the winter term was progressing, which students showed promise, how Mrs. Ashworth's sister in Durham was recovering from her illness. They spoke of the preparations being made for Christmas, of the decorations that would go up in the streets, of the services that would be held at the cathedral. Mr. Halbrook found himself mentioning, almost without meaning to, the candle on the high shelf, the one that burned longer than it ought. He had not spoken of it to anyone before, and he was surprised to hear the words coming from his own mouth. Mrs. Ashworth listened with interest, her head tilted slightly to one side, her expression thoughtful but not skeptical. Perhaps, she said when he had finished, it's the shop's way of holding on to something. Memory, maybe, or hope, or just the simple pleasure of burning a bit longer than expected. Mr. Halbrook considered this. That's a nicer explanation than most I've considered. Everything deserves a nice explanation if we can manage it, Mrs. Ashworth said firmly. The world is mysterious enough without us making it darker than it needs to be. They finished their tea as the church bells tolled noon, the sound rolling across the rooftops and in through the shop window, marking the passage of time in that old familiar way that had been marking it since long before either of them had been born. Mrs. Ashworth rose, straightening her skirts and reaching for her gloves. I suppose I must return to my duties. Mr. Palmer will be wondering where I've gotten to. Your usual order? Mr. Halbrook asked, standing as well. Yes, please. The bell chimed as she left, its voice bright and clear. Through the window, Mr. Halbrook watched her make her way down the street, the parcel tucked under her arm, her step light despite the puddles. The shop seemed quieter after she had gone, but it was not an empty quiet. It was the quiet of a space that had just held friendship, that still bore the warmth of shared company. Mr. Halbrook collected the teacups and returned them to their shelf, then stood for a moment in the center of his shop, surrounded by candles, surrounded by light. Outside, the rain was indeed easing, and somewhere above the clouds, the winter sun was trying to break through. Part 10. The last candle's glow. The hours passed softly, measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the slow burning of candles, the gradual shift of shadows across walls and ceiling, the quiet settling of the building as night deepened around it. Mr. Halbrook had moved his chair from behind the counter to a position facing the window. Though the curtains remained drawn, he sat there now, not quite dozing, but not quite fully awake either, existing in that peaceful state between consciousness and sleep, where thoughts drift like clouds and time loses its urgency. Sarah's candle burned on the counter, its flame steady and bright. Mr. Halbrook watched it from his chair, watched the way the light moved, the way the shadows danced, the way the whole shop seemed to breathe in rhythm with the flickering flame. One by one, the other candles in the shop had burned low. Mr. Halbrook had let them. He did not replace them as they guttered and died. Instead, he allowed the shop to grow gradually dimmer, to draw itself inward, to become smaller and more intimate as the pools of light contracted. The votive by the door had been the first to go, its small reservoir of wax exhausted after many hours of burning. The flame had grown smaller, and then blinked out, leaving a thin trail of smoke that rose and dispersed into the shadows. Then the pillar candle on the middle shelf. One by one they surrendered their light, each small death, unremarkable, yet somehow significant, like the falling of individual snowflakes, unnoticed in the moment, but contributing to the transformation of the whole. Mr. Halbrook did not stir from his chair. He simply watched, peaceful and patient, as the shop grew darker and quieter and more still. The candle in the workshop was next. He saw its light dim through the doorway, saw the moment when it flickered one final time and went out. The workshop fell into darkness, its tools and shelves and carefully organized materials disappearing into shadow. Now only a handful of candles remained burning in the shop proper. Their combined light was gentle, insufficient to reach the corners or illuminate the higher shelves. The shop had become a place of soft glow and deep shadow, a space that felt both smaller and somehow larger than it did during the day. Smaller because the light reached only so far, larger because the darkness beyond seemed to extend into infinity. Mr. Halbrook shifted slightly in his chair, easing muscles that had grown stiff from sitting. He was not a young man, and his body reminded him of this with increasing frequency. But tonight, the aches and stiffness seemed distant, unimportant. His attention was focused inward, or perhaps beyond himself entirely, to the quality of the moment, the texture of the silence, the way the candlelight made the familiar shop seem like a place half remembered from a dream. Another candle died, and another. The light continued to contract, to draw itself in like a flower closing for the night. The shadows on the walls had taken on a life of their own. They moved slowly, gently, responding to the imperceptible movements of the candle flames, to the small currents of air that flowed through the old building, to forces too subtle to name. They were not threatening, these shadows. They were companions, familiar presences that had shared the shop with Mr. Halbrook for as long as he could remember. He thought, in his dreaming, drifting state, about the nature of shadows. They were not things in themselves, but merely the absence of light. And yet, they possessed character, personality, beauty. A room lit by a single candle had different shadows than a room lit by a dozen candles. The shadows cast by candlelight were different from the shadows cast by gas lamps or electric lights. Softer, more forgiving, more honest, somehow in their gentle obscurity. The clock on the shelf, he could no longer see it, but he knew it was there, struck a late hour. 10, 11, midnight. The number didn't matter. What mattered was that the day had ended, that the work was done, that the shop and its keeper had earned their rest. Only 3 candles still burned now. Besides Sarah's, they formed a triangle of light in the darkness. 1 on the counter to the left of Sarah's candle, 1 on a shelf to the right, 1 on the small table near Mr. Halbrook's chair. He watched them with half-closed eyes, watched their flames waver and dance, watched the light they cast pulse gently like a heartbeat. Time was doing something strange. It was both passing and standing still. Hours might have been minutes. Minutes might have been hours. Past and present seemed to exist simultaneously, overlapping, interpenetrating. Mr. Halbrook was sitting in his shop on a winter night in his 73rd year, and he was also standing at this same counter as a young man, learning from his father. He was also a boy, watching his father work with wide, wondering eyes. He was also ancient, older than the stones of York itself, older than time, eternal as the light he had spent his life creating. The candle nearest to him, the one on the small table, gave a final flicker and went out. The sudden diminishment of light was barely noticeable, yet it changed everything. The shadows deepened. The shop drew further into itself. 2 candles now, beside Sarah's. Mr. Halbrook's breathing had slowed, deepened. His eyes were barely open, just slits through which he perceived the world not as distinct objects, but as patterns of light and dark, moving and still, warm and cool. He thought he heard something, a sound so soft it might have been imagination. Footsteps, breathing, the rustle of cloth, but when he tried to focus on it, it faded, or perhaps had never been there at all. The shop held only silence, and the gentle crackling of candles burning, and the occasional settling sound of old wood contracting in the cold. The candle on the shelf gave up its light, the flame shrinking to a point and then vanishing. A whisper of smoke rose and dissipated. 1 candle left now, beside Sarah's. The shop was very dark. The counter where Sarah's candle burned seemed to float in a sea of shadow, an island of light in infinite darkness. Mr. Halbrook could see nothing else clearly. The shelves had disappeared. The walls had receded into invisibility. The ceiling was lost in blackness. There was only the counter, the 2 candles, and the gentle glow they cast. Mr. Halbrook felt sleep approaching now, felt its soft wings settling over him like a blanket. He did not resist. There was no reason to resist. The day was done. The work was complete. Rest was not just earned but necessary. His eyes closed, then opened slightly, then closed again. The last candle, not Sarah's, but the final companion that had been keeping vigil with it, burned lower, lower. Its wax pool deepened. The wick grew long and began to lean, creating an elongated flame that cast strange wavering shadows. And then, with a gentleness that seemed almost courteous, it too went out. Now only Sarah's candle burned. The shop was very still, very quiet. The darkness beyond the small circle of candlelight was complete, absolute. It was not frightening, this darkness. It was restful, peaceful, the darkness of sleep, of night, of the gentle ending of all things, and the quiet beginning of all things that would come after. Sarah's candle burned with a flame that was clear and steady and strong. It cast its light across the counter, across the walls that could no longer be seen, across the shadows that moved in their slow, eternal dance. The flame did not waver, did not gutter, did not show any sign of diminishment. It simply burned as it had burned for 60 years, as it would burn for 60 more, or 600, or forever. A light that endured, a love that did not die. Mr. Halbrook was asleep now, or almost asleep, suspended in that space where dreams and reality blur into one. He felt no cold, no discomfort, only peace, only the warm presence of light in darkness, of constancy in change, of love in loss. The candle burned, time slowed, became like honey, like wax, like something so thick and slow-moving that it was almost not movement at all, but stillness, perfect stillness, the stillness at the heart of all things. The shadows moved, but barely, a slow swaying, like trees in the gentlest breeze. The flame burned, but without consuming. A miracle, or perhaps not a miracle at all, but simply the way things sometimes were, when love was deep enough and true enough and patient. Outside, the city slept. The snow lay pristine on the streets. The stars moved in their ancient courses across the winter sky. Time passed, as it always passed, carrying all things forward toward whatever endings and beginnings awaited them. But here, in the small shop on Stonegate, in the warm glow of a single candle's light, time had found a place to rest, to simply be, to burn without burning out. The candle's flame grew softer, not dimmer but softer, gentler, like a voice dropping to a whisper, softer still. Soft as sleep, soft as snow falling in silence, soft as the last thought before dreams take over completely. The light glowed, warm and golden and infinitely patient, holding back the darkness not through strength, but through simple persistence, through the quiet refusal to surrender, through love. And in that light, an old man slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of summers long past, of a girl with dark hair and bright eyes, of the life they might have lived together. Or perhaps not dreaming at all, perhaps simply resting, content, at peace, held safe in the gentle glow of candlelight and memory and love. The flame burned. The shop was still. Time moved like honey, and the darkness, knowing itself defeated by this small, persistent light, settled down to wait with infinite patience, as it always had, as it always would. The candle burned, and would burn, forever or near enough to make no difference. Outside, the lamplighters began their rounds, kindling small stars of warmth against the gathering night. And inside, the old goldsmith smiled and worked on, content in the knowledge that tomorrow the sun would rise again, the door would open again, and the great, beautiful, ordinary work of living would continue. For Aldrich Pennywhistle had learned what all wise souls eventually discover, that the measure of a life is not in its length or its drama, but in its depth of attention, its quality of care, its willingness to be present for the small, sacred moments that make up the great tapestry of human experience. He had lived such a life. He was living it still. And when his time came, as it would come to all, he would leave behind not monuments or fortunes, but something far more precious, the memory of kindness, the legacy of skill, the quiet example of a man who had chosen day after day to make the world just a little more beautiful, one careful repair at a time. That was the true gold. That was the lasting treasure. And that was the story of the goldsmith of Cheapside, a story that would be told in whispers and fragments long after he was gone, carried forward by the people whose lives he had touched, whose broken things he had mended, whose hearts he had helped to heal. It was a good story, a true story, a story worth telling. And in the end, what more could any soul hope for than to have lived a story worth the telling? The evening deepened. The stars emerged and the goldsmith of Cheapside worked on in his pool of lamplight, content and grateful and at peace with the world and with himself. Sleep, sleep, relax, and sleep. The road narrows before it ends. You may not have noticed when it happened. Exactly when the asphalt gave way to gravel, when the gravel softened into a dirt track worn smooth by years of sea wind and quiet footsteps. But somewhere along the way, the world you had come from began to feel very far away. The noise of it, the weight of it, all of that had begun to dissolve like mist burning off in the morning, leaving behind something quieter and older and more real. You follow the path as dusk deepens into a soft indigo haze. To your left, the sea. You can hear it before you can see it clearly. A low rhythmic murmur, patient as breathing, rising and falling against the stone below. The waves are gentle tonight. They speak in long, unhurried syllables, drawing themselves up and pulling back again and again in the language that the ocean has been speaking since long before anyone was here to listen. It is not an urgent sound. It asks nothing of you. It simply continues, as it always has, as it always will. The air is cool and carries with it the particular freshness of a coastal evening, salt and stone, and the faint sweetness of some low-growing coastal herb you cannot name but feel you have always known. You breathe it in slowly. You notice how your shoulders drop. You notice how your jaw, which you did not realize had been clenched, softens. You let the air in, and you let something else out. Something you have been carrying perhaps without knowing it. Ahead of you, the cliff rises gently. Gulls circle there, 3 or 4 of them, turning slow arcs against the sky. Their cries are distant, softened by the wind, and they seem less like disturbances than like signatures, small marks the sea makes in the air to say, here, this is the edge. This is the place where land becomes sky, becomes water. And then you see it. At first, it is only a shape against the fading light, a dark cylinder rising from the headland, set against the last pale wash of sunset in the west. But then, as you walk nearer, the lighthouse begins to resolve itself into something more specific and particular. Stone, you realize. Old gray stone. The kind that has absorbed centuries of wind and salt and moonlight and given them back in a certain quality of permanence, a certain steadiness that no new thing possesses. The lighthouse stands the way very old things stand, not rigidly, not defiantly, but with a settled confidence, as if it has long since made peace with the permanence of its purpose. The light has not yet come on, but soon. The sky is still holding its last pale colors, lavender and dusty rose in the west, deepening to a soft dark blue overhead, where the first stars are beginning to appear. You can see them now, just barely, as if they are waking gradually, finding their places. The lighthouse waits for darkness, as you do. There is a kinship in that, and you feel it. A lantern hangs at the gate of a low stone wall that surrounds the lighthouse and a small keeper's cottage at its base. The lantern burns steadily, its warm amber light falling in a gentle circle on the path. It is the kind of light that says, you are expected. Come in, rest now. The gate stands open just a little, as if it has been left so on purpose. You push it gently. The hinges do not creak so much as sigh, the way old things sigh when they've been doing the same thing for a long time and have come to find comfort in repetition. The path inside the wall is of smooth, flat stones, set into the earth, each one worn slightly in the center from the passage of boots over many years. Small, low-growing plants push up between them, thyme perhaps, or something similar, giving off the faintest herbal scent when the wind catches them. The cottage sits to one side of the lighthouse base, modest and square, with thick walls and small, deep-set windows from which warm light spills out onto the ground. You hear, rather than see, him first. A door opens. The sound of it is unhurried. Footsteps on stone. Slow, even, the footsteps of a person who has nowhere else to be and knows it. Then, a figure in the doorway, outlined by the golden interior light. An old man, not tall, with a weathered face and white hair, lifted at the temples by the evening breeze. He wears a heavy wool sweater the color of storm clouds, and he stands in the way that people stand who have spent a great deal of time outdoors, easy in their body, acquainted with stillness. He sees you and smiles. It is a slow smile, the kind that begins at the eyes. There is warmth in it, and something quieter than warmth, a kind of recognition, as if he has been expecting you, though you cannot think how. "Ah," he says. His voice is low and unhurried, roughened a little by sea air, but gentle. "You found your way, then?" "I think so," you say, and realize as you say it that you are not entirely sure which way you have found. To the lighthouse? Yes, but perhaps to something else as well, some quieter place inside yourself. The old man nods as if he understands this perfectly. "Come in out of the wind," he says. "I have the kettle on." Those words, simple as they are, settle over you like a warm blanket. You follow him inside. His name, he tells you as he moves about the small entrance hall, is Edric. He has kept this lighthouse for many years, so many that when you ask, he pauses for a moment, counting in some private way, and then laughs softly and says, "It doesn't matter exactly. Long enough that it feels like home," he says. Long enough that he has stopped thinking of the sea as separate from himself. The entrance hall is low-ceilinged and smells of wood smoke and something pleasantly herbal, dried lavender perhaps, hanging in a bundle from one of the old iron hooks. By the door, there are boots lined up with care and a row of coats in various stages of use and weathering. A barometer hangs on one wall, its needle pointing gently toward fair. Everything here is orderly and worn smooth with use and comfortable in the way that only well-loved things become. You remove your coat. You hang it on a hook. You breathe. From somewhere deeper in the cottage, the kettle begins its low building song. Through the entrance hall window, now that the light inside has lit the evening darker, you can see the beam sweeping out across the water for the first time. White and slow and immense, moving across the face of the dark sea, like a thought crossing a quiet mind. The lighthouse has come alive. The night has found its purpose, and you, standing here in this warm, small hall, with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a kettle, and the knowledge that the sea is just outside and going nowhere, you feel something that you have not felt in a long while. You feel perfectly, completely still. "The light always settles something in me," Edric says from the next room, as if he has read your thought. "It did the first time I saw it, all those years ago. It does still." You move toward his voice, toward the warmth of the fire you can hear now crackling softly, toward the amber glow that spills through the doorway like an invitation. Outside, the beam sweeps and sweeps. The waves continue their ancient conversation with the stone below. Somewhere out on the water, a foghorn sounds, low and long and full of a tenderness you hadn't known a foghorn could have. It fades. The waves continue. The beam sweeps on. You are here. You are safe. The edge of the world turns out to be exactly the right place to rest. Part 2, The Lighthouse Keeper's Home. The cottage is small, and it is everything. That is the first thing you understand as Edric leads you through the low doorway and into the sitting room, that a space can be small and still contain multitudes. That walls, if the right things have happened within them over enough years, develop a kind of warmth that has nothing to do with the fire, though the fire helps. It crackles in a wide stone hearth at the far end of the room, unhurried and generous, casting its amber light across everything it touches and making everything it touches look like something from a memory you almost have. You stand for a moment in the doorway and simply look. The floors are old wood, darkened with age and use, smooth underfoot in the way of floors that have known many years of quiet footsteps. They creak very softly as Edric moves across them. Not an alarming creak, but a settling one. The sound of a house that knows you are here and is acknowledging it. A woven rug in faded blues and greens covers the center of the room, its pattern worn to something gentle and almost abstract, like a map of a sea that exists only in dreams. Along one wall, floor to ceiling, books, not arranged for show but for use, some standing upright, some leaning, some lying flat as bookmarks for the others. Their spines are a long, slow conversation of colors: deep red, sea green, the brown of wet sand, the cream of old paper. Some have no titles you can read from here, worn away by the handling of years. Others you can just make out charts, tide records, natural histories of coastal birds, the memoirs of captains and navigators, collections of poetry, a great many novels with a particular softness of books that have been read more than once. Between the books, tucked into the shelves like small, quiet treasures, a large conch shell, its interior a faded rose, a glass float, pale green, the kind that used to travel on fishing nets, a small brass compass in a leather case, a piece of driftwood worn by the sea into something almost sculptural, 3 or 4 smooth stones in colors that could only have come from this particular shore. You feel, looking at all of this, that you are reading a life. Sit, sit, Edric says, gesturing toward one of the 2 armchairs by the fire. They are old chairs, wide and deep, and upholstered in a fabric that has faded from what might once have been burgundy to something softer, the color of a rose, pressed in a book and kept for years. The cushions have molded themselves over time to the shapes of the people who have sat in them, and when you lower yourself into one, it receives you with a kind of considered ease, as if it has been waiting for exactly someone your size and weight and wariness. You sink in, you let out a breath. The fire speaks quietly to itself in the hearth. From the kitchen, a small room off the sitting room, partially visible through an open door, come the sounds of Edric moving about, the soft percussion of a cabinet opening, the gentle clink of ceramic, the low song of the kettle beginning its work again. The sounds are unhurried. They are the sounds of a person who does not rush anything, who has learned, or perhaps always known, that things happen at the speed they need to and no faster. The fire burns lower and softer. You drink your tea in slow, warm sips. The ginger has settled into a pleasant warmth somewhere in your chest. Outside, the beam sweeps and sweeps. You notice that you have stopped counting your worries, that they have not so much disappeared as receded, like the tide pulling back to reveal the clean, smooth sand beneath. Edric tells you about the winter storms, not with fear in his voice, but with a kind of respectful wonder, the way you speak of things that are larger than you and always will be. He tells you about the seabirds that nest in the cliff below every spring, the way they return to the exact same ledge year after year, finding their way home across thousands of miles of open ocean. He tells you about the ships he has watched pass, their lights moving slowly across the dark water, and how he has thought about the people on them, going somewhere, and felt a quiet goodwill toward every one. The cottage holds all of this. The books hold it. The charts hold it. The fire holds it and gives it back as warmth. At some point, you could not say exactly when, you realize that your eyes have grown heavy, not unpleasantly, in the way that eyes grow heavy when the body at last believes it is safe, when the nervous system puts down what it has been carrying and says, here is enough. Here we can rest. Edric notices the way he seems to notice everything, quietly, without making much of it. The guest room is just at the base of the tower, he says, setting down his mug. I've made it up. There's a window that looks east, over the water. He pauses. You'll hear the light turning. Some people find it takes getting used to. Most find they sleep better for it. He leads you through a narrow doorway and into a short passage that curves slightly. You are entering the base of the lighthouse itself now, you realize. The walls here are stone and thicker, and they have a coolness that is not unpleasant. There is a low wooden door, which he opens, and beyond it, a small room that is nearly round, as the lighthouse is round, with a ceiling that follows the curve of the stone walls. The bed is narrow and high and covered with quilts in the blues and whites of seafaring things. There is a small window, round as a porthole, as he said, looking east. Through it, the night sky, and just at the edge of vision, the faint, pale line where sky meets sea. Sleep well, Edric says, and his voice is low and warm and certain, the way voices are when they mean what they say. He pulls the door closed behind him. His footsteps move back down the passage. Unhurried, you sit on the edge of the bed. The quilts are cool and soft under your hands. The lighthouse beam sweeps outside, and through the porthole window, its light moves briefly across the ceiling. Once, and then the room is dark again, and then again, slow and even and rhythmic as breathing. You lie back. The pillow is soft, the quilts are heavier than you expected, and exactly the right weight. The sound of the waves comes through the stone walls, muffled and deepened by the thickness of them, so that it is less a sound than a feeling, a vibration at the very base of things, a rhythm the world keeps with or without your attention. You close your eyes. The light sweeps once more across the ceiling. The sea breathes below. You're held here in the old stone between the land and the water, in the keeping of the light.